No, the fourth chapter and third chapter and the fourth chapter can be quite confusing. I think we'll go through them a little bit other because he's writing to Hebrews, and the Hebrews would better understand what he was talking about, whereas the Christians wouldn't necessarily, because they wouldn't know. Sometimes when he speaks about the ritual in the temple, very few Gentiles are going to know what he's talking about offhand. But so it was specifically for the Jews that he says some of these things. Even some of the quotes he makes from the Old Testament in chapter 2 and 3 and 4, he doesn't complete the quotes, he just says a few words from them, but all the Jews would know what he was talking about because they would be familiar with it. But the Gentiles wouldn't necessarily be familiar with it. And so I think we'll talk about that part of it a little bit later, because after we get through when he describes the parts of the temple. And but he does talk about, when he says in the time of the rebellions, the Jews would understand he's talking about the time when Moses was leading the people across the Sinai desert, and they were constantly revolting against Moses and complaining and ready to sort of riot or rebel. And a lot of the Gentiles wouldn't have even known that story, but the Jews knew what he was talking about, and they hardened their hearts in the wilderness against Moses. And the little parts when he's talking about Joshua, or as they say in Greek, Jesus, son of Nun, he doesn't tell much of the story, he just tells a few quotes from it, of lines. And of course the Hebrews all knew what he was talking about. The Gentiles wouldn't necessarily have had a clue what he was talking about. But I want to read the last verse of this, and it's of chapter 4, because it's very significant to us. Let's remember when they talk about Jesus Christ as a sacrifice, it's not quite so simple, because none of the sacrifices in the Old Testament, except the scapegoat, were said to carry anybody else's sins, or to be actually bear their sins. So when we talk about the scapegoat, they would drive the scapegoat into the wilderness, and through the ritual, they put the sins of the whole community on it, and then it would go into the wilderness. But it wasn't killed. They never offered it as a blood sacrifice for sins. So we can't suggest that any of the Old Testament sacrifices, except one, were image of Christ to come, because none of them bore anybody else's sins. They didn't bear vicarial sacrifices, none of them were, except the scapegoat, which was not killed, but was driven out of the community. And in 1 Corinthians, we have Apostle Paul saying, our Pascha is sanctified. So I want to go back again, as we have before, and say that Christ is our Pascha lamb. That's why we use the word Pascha. We don't use the word Easter, because it doesn't mean anything. But the Old Testament Pascha was when Moses commanded the people they were going to offer a lamb, they were going to cook it, but they were going to eat it in preparation for going into freedom. But the blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost, and we understand by our tradition in the sign of the cross, and death passed over. So Pascha, or Passover in English, is for the Passover of death. So this is a Eucharistic sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of thanksgiving when the Jews offered it after they were in Israel. They would offer it every year, the Passover lamb, the Paschal lamb, a thanksgiving for their freedom and commemoration of their being delivered from bondage. And so it wasn't at all a sin offering. It was something the people ate themselves. And in the case of the first Pascha, in the Old Testament Pascha, the Jews were eating it in preparation, strengthening themselves to flee across the desert into freedom. and afterward they offered every year in Thanksgiving. So it was sort of prefiguring the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, which we partake of still every Sunday. And we call it the Eucharist. In Greek it's called the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. And it's thanksgiving for our freedom, for our being delivered from bondage, as well as whatever else it is. So we receive Holy Communion, confessing that Christ has set us free, that He's liberated us. And we're partaking of this thanksgiving offering. That's why, you know, when we come out and say, let us lift up our hearts, and then turn around and say, Eucharistic, let us, Eucharistic to the Lord, let us give thanks to the Lord. And in Greek it's Eucharistia. Eucharistia. They say Eucharistia to Kyriou. And that means let us give thanks to the Lord. And that's when the priest goes in. It is meet and right to offer the Eucharist. And the little hymn that the Russians added doesn't really belong there. They just wanted to fill in time so the priest could say the prayer silently. So that's why we only say it is meet and right. It is meet and right to enter into the Eucharist. That the priest is receiving permission from the people to continue with the service. As St. John Chrysostom says, you wait for the assent of the people, the assent of the congregation to go back into the altar and continue the Eucharistic service. But we have to think of it, first of all, in terms of thanksgiving when we approach Holy Communion, and thanksgiving for the freedom that Christ has given us and for His delivering us from bondage. So that's just, we regard the Eucharist in many respects, but that's the Holy Communion. But the Holy Communion is called the Eucharist, that is the thanksgiving. And so that's the first and foremost, that's what the word Pascha comes from. And Pascha means the passing over of death, that Christ conquered the power of death by His resurrection. So Pascha is a dogmatic word for us. And in all Orthodox Christian languages, we use Pascha or a variation of Pascha, one or the other variation of it. And understanding that that's the Passover of death. That's the true and perfect Passover. The Old Testament Passover was only a prophecy about the Passover of Christ, the Pascha of Christ. And when we approach the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, we also approach it realizing that it gives us a spiritual strength and spiritual power, say for the healing of soul and body, and precisely, more especially for the soul. Because our soul, we can go to the doctor many times about our body. You can't go to the doctor about your soul. So we come and receive for the healing of soul and body. And that's also, if as we'll find out in the book of Hebrews, a covenant, you remember we said before, was always sealed with blood. Because the Jews considered blood to be life itself. And so they would always seal a covenant with blood. So Christ on the cross sealed a new covenant for us. So when we partake of the body and blood of Christ, we're also partaking of the seal of the new covenant, the new covenant that Christ has made with us. And today, if you remember in the Apostle reading, he reminds us, he's talking about Hagar and Sarah, but Sarah's son who was freeborn. And he's talking about us being children of the promise. Again, remember we've mentioned this many times, that we're children of the promise, not children of the law. And we have a new covenant sealed in the promise with Abraham, and a new covenant sealed in the blood of Jesus Christ, who's liberated us and set us free. And when he says, I realize that there's a little bit of a confusion about the translation in English. It says he's torn up the handwriting that was against us. Actually, it says he's torn up the manuscript that was against us, the manuscript of the law. I mean, manuscript literally translated means handwriting, of course, but it's torn up the manuscript of the law that was against us. So the law is God. We don't have to stone anybody to death. So we're not under the law, we're under the promise. And so the manuscript that was against us, that is the manuscript of the law, is gone. So that's. But anyway, the last few verses of chapter 4, that having then a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is not able to sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all respects according to our likeness, but without sin. Let us therefore come with boldness before the throne of grace, that we might receive mercy and find grace for help in due season. And it's also a theme that we've touched on before, that as a high priest, Christ, the incarnation had many purposes. But one of them was to demonstrate, so we could actually see and understand. You know, it's one thing to just say in words, but to understand that Christ has taken on our flesh, suffered the temptations that we suffer, suffered the things that we suffer in life. Consequently, we know that he understands us. And we could say, well, God knows everything, but for us, we have to see. We have to have some testimony. And even for Christ to die on the cross, where it was seen and we could see. Now, it was important for us to see this mystery of Christ on the cross, identifying himself with the greatest sinners, the greatest criminals, everybody in the whole region who was guilty of the worst things, but he came for them. He came for all levels of humanity. And he opens his arms to all levels of humanity. And so we don't have to despair of ourselves unless we harden our hearts. And people do that, you know. People want to make excuses to do things they like to do, which are not very good. We can talk ourselves into being able to commit any sin or any crime, or our temptations can be some so strong that we can't, at the moment, resist them, and we don't turn to prayer and fasting to overcome them. And we can sort of harden our hearts. We can't harden our conscience. Our conscience is going to, we cannot listen to our conscience, but our conscience is not going to be still. It's going to testify to us that we're doing wrong. And we can harden our heart. And we can commit anything we want to by hardening our hearts. And sometimes it's in the foolishness of our passions that we lose control and harden our hearts. And I've given some examples before, but you can even harden your heart to the point you can commit murder. And your conscience might tell you no, but you've turned it off. You don't listen. You don't want to hear. And that's what Christ, the apostles talking about. We hear these things, but they don't register with us. They don't mean anything. We close them out. And we can hear without hearing. And that's why Christ said, the hearing they might hear, but not, they're closed off because hearing, they don't hear, that they could repent and change their ways. But how we don't hear, even though we hear, is we turn up our conscience. And we try to close it out. We don't listen to it. And our heart takes over, and our emotions, so we're governed by our emotions without using any kind of reason. And we think that, I mentioned one extreme case of the man who met a woman in the pub and his emotions took over. And he became attached. He thought he was in love with her, and he went home and murdered his wife and children in order to have this other woman because his wife and children were in the way. So that's how extreme it can get. That's how far it can go when we start to harden our hearts. So when the scripture talks about not hardening our hearts, it's a very serious business because we can do terrible things when we harden our hearts, but and don't listen to our conscience. So that's why some of the Holy Fathers have told us in the Great Judgment, our conscience will be our only judge. It's a judge that we can't bribe. it's going to speak the truth, and we're not going to be able to hide from it. That's why, in fact, the so-called particular judgment, or sometimes called the partial judgment or whatever, it's simply the conscience making you aware of your condition. That's all it consists in, is your conscience making you completely aware of your condition after you've departed this life. And then you have a certain fearful waiting, fearful expectation of Saint Afrat the Persian. He says, it's as though we were sleeping and dreaming of the future and not wanting to wake up because of what our conscience has testified to us. We don't wake up and face it. On the other hand, we can be anticipating waking up because it's with joy. So if you think about your conscience and your heart sometime are in conflict. And that's why we talk about bringing the heart and the conscience into accord with one another. And we're talking about bringing the heart into accord with the conscience. We don't want the conscience to be in accord with our emotions because our emotions are very deceptive sometimes. You know, they're necessary, but they can be very deceptive. They can lead us into strange things. So, but the main thing that Apostle Paul is clearly talking to the Hebrews, who would have understood when he said, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." I mean, Goyim, the Greeks and Romans wouldn't have had a clue who Melchizedek was, but the Jews knew very well. So when he says, "You're a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek," the Hebrews knew what he was talking about, and that this is written to the Hebrews. And it's a different priesthood, a priesthood that's not according to, Aaron's descendants were all the priests of Israel. They were the priest of an old covenant. And Melchizedek appears briefly and then disappears, but he's not the priest of the old covenant. He's identified as a priest, but not the priest of the old covenant, the old law. So now we have a priest after the order of Melchizedek, who's not a priest of the law. He's not a priest of the old covenant, the Old Testament. He's a priest of the New Testament, the New Covenant. So we have a new priesthood that's not according to the order of the flesh, not according to mankind, not according to inheritance from Aaron or the Levites, but a priest that came from nowhere. He's never identified where he came from. I mean, he's the Melka is king, so he's king of peace. He's called the king of Salem, the king of peace, in Scripture. And then he disappears. And now when Christ appears, Paul says, well, here you have the priest after the order of Melchizedek. He came from, you don't really know where. We just call him the king of peace, but here he is. And he's a priest of something new, something completely changing what was going before. So that's how, when describing the priesthood in this chapter. So that, in fact, Paul says that concerning whom it is as much of our discourse and difficult in interpretation to speak. It's very difficult to explain this to people. And it's more difficult to explain it to the non-Jews. And he intends for the non-Jews to read this. But it's very difficult to interpret and explain to non-Jews because they don't have the tradition. See, the thing is, the Jews had a tradition that made it possible for them to understand. And that's where sacred tradition comes in. We read the New Testament, we find things that are difficult to interpret, we find things that can be interpreted dozens of different ways, and then all of a sudden we say, how do we know for sure what it means? Because we have the sacred tradition of the church. And remember, the New Testament was created by the church. The church was not created by the Bible. The Bible was created by the church. So the Bible is not a book for everyone. It's a book for the church. And everyone else, it seems, who gets a hold of it, really gets it screwed up. They don't really comprehend it because they don't have the sacred tradition. They don't have this interplay between that tradition that even the Jews themselves had lost much of the tradition by Christ's time. But you have this interplay between the traditions of Israel and the revelations of Christ. And you have to have both to really understand what's being said, because he's speaking as a Jew to the Jews. So what he's saying is really comprehended by sacred tradition of the Jewish sacred tradition, and then passes into Orthodox Christian sacred tradition with the Holy Fathers, explaining how it fits together, how the puzzle fits together. And it's why Protestants, I mean, God love them, they do struggle toward Christ, but it's why they have 4,000 different Protestant denominations now, all of whom don't agree with each other, because they have no sacred tradition, they have no foundation, no basis. And it's why when they tell us things that sound confusing, we said, well, let me go check it out first. I mean, you don't have the proper witness, you don't have the tradition. So I better go to the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Holy Fathers and find out how it was understood in the ancient church. You know, some of the Holy Fathers who were writing before the church had created the Bible. So the liturgy existed before what we call the Bible. I mean, it was never a book, a single book. But so we have to look back at how did the ancient church really understand the gospel of Jesus Christ and the message of Christ before there was a book. And the liturgy really unfolds to us the understanding of the gospel itself, the understanding of Christ's words and the apostles' words. But it unfolds to us the understanding of creation, the understanding of Christ's gospel before there was a book. So this is how the earliest Christians, the very first Christians in the apostles' time, understood the gospel of Jesus Christ in the divine liturgy. So that's why understanding it through the liturgy is so terribly important to us and all. So I think I just wanted to talk about the priesthood of Christ, and there are some words that come up in here that are sometimes confusing. Why is Christ a propitiation? You know, the word propitiation means to satisfy something. And sometimes it sounds as if Christ is trying to get God to be merciful. And since Christ is God, that's not possible. But sometimes that's interpreted as saying that Christ died to satisfy God. In other words, Christ died to save us from God. That's the general teaching in the West, because they use these words like propitiation and things that, without really grasping the fullness of what the sacrifices meant. So we got to plow our way through this a little bit slowly, but just to understand that our high priest is one who has manifest God's co-suffering love with us. Why? Because, as he says, we have a high priest who suffered our temptations, who suffered our misery and things, and yet without sin. So he does understand us. He can not only be sympathetic, but he can be genuinely co-suffering and compassionate, because he knows what we're struggling with. In the first antiphon we say, he remembers that we're dust. He doesn't ask more of us than is possible. So we don't need to worry too much about that. God is infinitely merciful. And it's what we strive to do, we never can fully complete it. But Christ has made up the difference for us. He's become a man in the flesh, one of us. And he built the bridge, that the cross is the bridge. And he has made up the difference for us. We struggle towards something we never can quite accomplish, but we know that for the sake of all humanity in the flesh, with our human nature, Christ has made up the difference for humanity. And he's come to redeem the whole human nature. Well, that's part of the priesthood too. As the priest in the Old Testament offered sacrifices, why? God didn't need that. Remember, God says, the world is mine, the earth is mine, and the fullness thereof. And again, he says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you, because the earth is mine and the fullness thereof. So what you're offering, I don't need it. And even the prophets tell us, in Jeremiah especially, that your sacrifices are nothing to me. I don't need any of that. So the sacrifices are for your sake. They're to give you something to do so that you can know that you've made the effort. You can know that you've made a real effort, a real concrete action to do something. And this is there to keep you from falling into the pagan sacrifices, where, they sacrificed humans sometimes. And so the sacrifices were given to Israel for the people's sake. Not for God's sake, not because God needed something, but the people needed it. The people needed to do something. If you never came to church, you never said your prayers, you never received communion, you never tried to discover what it is you're supposed to believe, before long you would yourself just be pagans. You would be in the world as nothing. You have to do something. And for us, it's more simple than having to go to Jerusalem and bringing a pair of turtle doves or a lamb or something. For us, it's the sacrifices of the world around us, the religions of the world around us, don't involve the kind of sacrifices that we have to have something to keep us apart from them. We have a different type of sacrifice to make now, and the sacrifice is ourselves. The sacrifice is a contrite spirit and a humble heart that we make to God. So what we are called upon to do is to come into the church and separate ourselves from the philosophies and the ideas of the world and the passions of the world and the idolatries that we have around us. I mean, the advertising industry is the serpent of Eden. And we're all Adam and Eve, and the advertising industry wants us to eat the fruit we're not supposed to eat. And, it tells you, well, happiness is just buy another pair of tennis shoes and you'll be happy. Buy this and you're really going to be happy. I remember having a friend at university who went deeply into debt and bought a new car, and came and he was so proud of it. He had to call everybody, he said, come and see my new car. We all go and see new car. And about 5 years later, he said, I thought that new car was going to make me happy and was going to change my life, but it just made me more miserable because I know I've got this debt to pay off. So that's what happens with the advertising industry. You've got to have one more, you've got to have this one, you've got to have that one. And that's the idolatry we're struggling against. That's the philosophy and the ideologies of the world that we're struggling against. That we're trying not to be partakers, not to condemn them. As Apostle Paul also tells us, the people who are outside the church, they're judged by something else, not by us. So, and Apostle Paul says, I think in Corinthians also, that I don't want you to fellowship with fornicators and thieves and murderers and robbers and stuff. He says, but not altogether, he said, because then you'd have to leave the world completely because the world is full of such people. But at least inside the church, don't fellowship with them. If somebody's a murderer or a robber and things, you don't sort of say, oh, that's okay, it's fine. You can come and say, no, well, we can't tell them it's okay. But he says we can't bother ourselves judging those who are outside the church, because then we have to completely leave the world altogether. We have to work with people who do some of these things. We have to go shopping in the stores with some people who do some of these things. And we have to hope that we're not in the wrong place at the wrong time and somebody decides to rob a bank. But it's still the priest of our covenant. It's the opposite of what the world is around us. And so coming into the church, the Divine Liturgy, Holy Communion, the other services, are all like the Old Testament sacrifices. They're keeping us apart from the idolatry of the world and teaching us another frame of mind, another way of thinking than the way the world thinks. So that's part of what the faith is and part of how our sacrifice is related to the Old Testament sacrifices. Anyway, does anybody have anything to add or ask?
Vladika, why the old church, many times we hear that old church was a barren church.
Hmm?
An old church, I mean, the Old Testament church was a barren.
Oh, well, because it didn't bear the fruit of salvation. It bore the fruit of people struggling toward righteousness, but never attaining righteousness. But it had only the promise. And that's why the Old Testament women prophets, usually old women who were barren, not able to bear children until God gave them a special miracle of grace. Then they bore children. But each one of those incidents was a prophecy, a revelation about something. You know, Hannah bore Samuel, who replaced the corrupt priesthood. So we had a new priesthood in Samuel, because the priests who were serving in the temple had become corrupt and sort of like televangelists. And when Sarah bore the beginning of the holy nation, the beginning of the promise was Isaac. And of course, Zachary and Elizabeth bore the forerunner, the new prophet. But they were all types of the Old Testament church. It was there. It had God's miracles some way, and but it didn't bear the fullness of salvation, so it's called barren. And then, at the dawn of the New Testament, the New Covenant, instead of a barren old woman, it passes to a young virgin. And she bears a child, who is the incarnation. But when it passes from barren old women like Joachim and Anna and Zachary and Elizabeth to a young virgin, now it's full of life. It's going to bear fruit. It's going to be productive. It's no longer a barren old woman, but it's a young virgin who comes through and bears Christ. So throughout the Old Testament, they call the church barren. There was always hope, but there wasn't anything that could really reconcile the nature of it. That's why we study the Old Testament. We always see people's failures. Even people who are called and chosen by God failed some way. I mean, Solomon had wisdom, but he didn't use wisdom. You know, he was reputed for his wisdom, but he didn't always use it because his passions got in the way. And sometimes he wanted something that was unwise, and he did it because he wanted it. So his wisdom didn't save him in that. And David's called a man after God's own heart, because he wants to get rid of idolatry. But then he has men killed so he can have his wife. So there's always a shortfall here. There's always something that doesn't quite work. You know, some of the big people like, I think Jeroboam would be called, but he fails. And some of the other kings were chosen by God, but they failed some way. And I mean, even Saul was chosen, but Saul fell into his own passions. And there was never someone who could come and fulfill this reunion between God and man without failing until Jesus Christ. So there was always, if you read the Old Testament, it's a story of man's failures. It's a story of our being alienated from God, alienated from even the rest of the nation sometimes. And it's only in Christ that we see the reconciliation between God and man, the end of our alienation. So Jesus Christ didn't fail. So he came to redeem our human nature, not just to redeem me and me. You know, in the 1800s, they came up with this sort of, I guess, egotism. Christ is my own personal Savior. Well, that's fine, but Christ is the Savior of the community. And we're called into community because we're not called to love just ourselves. We're called to have love within the community. And it's an unselfish love that we defeat the power of Satan. You know, I know we've talked about this a lot of times, but I mean, the great mystery of marriage is a struggle to love somebody who's opposite of you with an unselfish love. And it's that unselfish love, not just ordinary love, but unselfish love, that gives us the strength to overcome evil. It gives us the strength to overcome the evil one. It's that love between husband and wife is so valuable because it has to, in order to work, it has to be an unselfish love. But at the same time, it has to have freedom. So and when there are children, there aren't always children, but when there are children, of course, they give us even greater unselfish love. You know, every parent will sacrifice for their children. So it's a greater unselfish love. Hopefully the children will sacrifice for the parents too. But the whole thing that we're working with here, when we talk about family, when we talk about marriage, when we talk about community, when we talk about a congregation, when we talk about worshiping together, we're talking about growth in unselfish love. And a growth in love for each other without saying, well, it's, you know, Father, it wasn't Womanides, it was Potus Cantagro. He says, sometimes we approach the faith like a man who says, I'm totally in love with the Potini. The only thing is, I wish she'd dye her hair because I don't like the color. And, well, if only she had, you know, black eyes instead of brown, it would be better. But I love her completely. I absolutely love her completely. I wish she was a little bit taller. I mean, I wish she would dress better, but I love her completely. You know, but, you know, so I love the church, but I wish the services weren't so long. You know, I love the priest, but I wish he didn't have a long beard. So, Father John Romanides says the definition of orthodoxy that most people see is long robes, long services, and long beards. So, but it's all long. So, but I don't know, somehow we're all singing together is joyous and everything. But it's all the mystery. One of the great mysteries is the growth in unselfish love.
Can we compare unselfish love with unconditional love?
Well, no, because sometimes
That's right.
sometimes unconditional love can spoil somebody, can ruin somebody.
That's true.
You know, I've seen this unconditional. I was called by a Romanian family one time to come down to Richmond. The boy was always getting in trouble with narcotics and car wreck, and he would drink and everything. His parents gave him such unconditional love, they always covered for him.
Okay.
And they always would, whatever he did, oh no, we love you, we're going to cover for you. You don't have to take any responsibility. And I think I told a story once. They called me and told me I would come and talk to you know, Ciprian. And so I talked to him on the phone. I said, well, look, it's a long way for me to drive, so if I come down there, you guarantee me you're going to sit and talk to me and listen to me. Oh, yeah, I'll do that. So I show up, and right away he makes a beeline for his bedroom, locks his door on the inside. So I said, wait a minute, I came all this way, and I'm listening to the parents, how they covered up for his automobile accidents, how they paid for his new car, how they gave him money, and of course he would go spend on drugs. So I went upstairs. I said, you told me you were going to sit and talk to me. No, open the door and sit and talk to me. No, he didn't want to open the door. So I kicked the door open. So I just put my foot against the door. I said, you promised me you were going to talk to me, so sit and talk. So we talked for a little while. And then after I decided his parents were the real problem, not him, because they gave him too much unconditional love. They gave him, there were no conditions and no responsibility.
Yeah.
And they covered for him, so he didn't have any responsibility. So anyway, I don't think anything ever became of it, but I told the parents, you're the problem. You go see a doctor, see a psychiatrist or something. You know, see a counselor, because you're the problem. You raised this kid with no responsibility. You raised him with no sense of right and wrong, no sense of guilt. You just covered for him everything you did. And also, I think once we had a counselor at Sardis High School near the old monastery. And he was an old believer, so he came up once in a while to the monastery. Then he asked me, we talked about problems with kids. He said, I've got one boy that's, says he comes from a really good home, and he's well-dressed, he has, you know, everything, but he skips school a lot. And I don't know what's going on, so he's coming down and we'll talk to him. So the kid was sitting on the doorstep, and his parents were both at work. He was not in school that day, but he's sitting on the front doorstep. And so when John and I got out of the car, he started running this way. So John went that way and I went this way, and we headed him off. Set him down, and we were talking to him, and he said, finally, just asked him his problem. He said, my parents don't love me. And John said, how do you say their parents don't love you? They give you everything. You know, everything you want, you've got. He says, yeah, but they don't love me because they let me do anything I want. Yeah.
The kids were
They don't love
smarter,
me because they let me do
smarter than the
anything I want.
parents.
So they don't try to keep me out of trouble. They don't, you know, they just never discipline me, never try to, you know, punish him for something. You know, you have to have some kind of discipline. Well, chastisement. I don't like the word punishment. It's chastisement. Who we love, he chastises, and who we love, we chastise sometimes. And if you let a child do anything they want, and you don't set limits or boundaries on them, they know you don't love them. The kids join gangs because they desire some kind of discipline and some kind of order. And in gangs, the order and discipline is deadly. It's very strong. But that's why a lot of times young people think, well, they were nice young people, they come from good families, why are they in the gang? Because they have boundaries and they have discipline.
Of the rules.
Yeah, and then his life is not chaos anymore. You know, that happened to me once. I was dealing with a seminary. I had Adam with me still. And every Sunday after church, I went to serve a parish church. It didn't have a priest. And I said, well, where do you want to eat? What movie do you want to go to? And where are we going to go today? And finally Adam says, Dad, I'm too young to make all these decisions. You're supposed to make some of them for me. Oh, there it was. So I was chastened. I was chastised. So I had to make some of these decisions. And anyway, that's part of what the sweet mystery of the parish, I call it, where we learn to have unselfish love, where we love to have, as Christ commanded us, love for one another. Love one another as I've loved you. So that's what the parish is really for. It's for that beginning of the fulfillment of the commandments of Jesus Christ. And that's why we have to learn to love one another, even some of the people we'd like to strangle. We feel like that once in a while. But still we have to have love for one another. Anyway, we have to overcome all these things. So anyway, that's enough for today.
Thank you.